there's many sex scenes in true life. There's also quite a bit of sex, not necessarily scenes, but sex in your poetry. But they are rendered in a different context each time. Talk about how to write about sex and sex scenes, and also if there's anyone published that does it particularly well that you could elaborate upon.
Give me an example of a sex scene that I wrote.
A sex scene that you wrote? Well, you've mentioned Maggie a step previously. There's Beyond Your Swans, I believe, where it speaks
Oh,
of
where
sex.
her roommate, the Norwegian or whatever, the Swedish gal, yeah, the one of the threesome. I don't.
There's also quite a bit of sex in your poetry. You could just take a quick scan of your poems in the omnisonnets, and you'll find a sex scene here or there.
Yeah, I mean,
And the Siamese
they were love
reflection is
poems
also a good
basically.
example too, where it's describing the Siamese twins having sex with one of
Yeah.
their wives, and it goes into that. It's a very interesting image, and it's not the same generic shit. But a few published writers I could think of off the top of my head. But what do you think?
I'm trying to think. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any published writers that, well, with the exception of maybe Pablo Neruda's love poems that have some sexual imagery. At his best, Pablo Neruda is probably the best published love poet that I can think of. Um, but even there, his tended to be more vivid colors and dynamic movements. You have to, uh, when I write about something, I try to put it in a different way. When I'm doing the spy book, there are many women that he's involved with, and I try to put them in different ways. I'm using this girl who is one of Alex Sherimit's ex-girlfriends as the model for this young sort of exotic babe that the spy, when he's about at retirement age, right before 9/11, falls in love with, even though she's like 30 years younger. So I'm trying to get into his mind that he's lusting for her body, but at the same time, he's trying to step back and say, why am I, how can I feel this for someone who wasn't born until I was in early middle age, kind of thing. So again, it's about trying to get different ideas about what to do. I think I've even done poems that had animals in mid-coitus here or there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's probably at least half a dozen. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I know that I've done it.
Yeah. You also mentioned how in a previous segment about how you see things. You know, 10 characters in a novel of yours, they may see a part of what you see, but you'll see the whole. That's kind of in the whole Whitmanian idea. This world where the fire was is a memoir in the last of your true life memoirs.
Yeah.
It elaborates a bit on that as well as gets into other ideas we may speak about later. But there's a scene in Norwegian, and again, I have not read the total of Norwegian. There's a scene in Norwegian where Polly looks at the ceiling and sees a speck, and he sees that speck, and then it kind of cranes just like a film would, and it's not Polly looking at the speck now; it's the Norwegian, and that's an interesting technique that's used there. Similar to that, I think in the sex scenes, the reason that they stand out as compared to other published writers is that you also see things out of that. You see the figurative and the literal in those sex scenes. You see the possibilities of relationships with these women. You see how some of them are feeling at that point too, and not just the physical nature of them. And that is one of the things that stands out there. Plus, there's many fantasies that go into that, and this is the thing too that many readers, many watchers, all sorts of consumers of art don't seem to understand. The big grand moments, well, they are not easy to do. Those tiny moments where a character just sees something and reacts to it are far more important to characterization than the grand dialogues or the big scenes. Those are impossible for anyone else to do, of course, but we're talking about these transitionary devices that lead into another scene and make it better.
Well, they provide the frame. We talked about the rape scene with Gino Vincetti in the Vincetti Brothers, and I use very arachnid spider-like imagery there. And also, we talked about the impotence of having the watcher Aldo. So we're watching Aldo watching his brother rape the woman, and so the woman is basically 4 levels removed from the act, even though she's the one being violated, because we have her, we have Gino on top of her, we have Aldo watching Gino, we have the reader reading about Aldo, and so
And Manny Cole.
yeah, and Manny Cole, yeah,
Watching the whole
yeah,
scene.
yeah. So yeah, you got me. You got there's even an extra layer that I forgot. So uh, again, it's about trying to get into different things because sex is one of those things that at one time it's so big in our society, but it really occupies such a small portion. I think in one of in some way I wrote, maybe it was arguing with someone. I said, if I were to, but even your average person, even someone like a Brad Pitt or some movie star who's boffing supermodels or something, Tom Cruise or something, if you were to add up all the times that he had sex, uh, 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 you know, you're talking about maybe you could have maybe 3 or 4 solid weeks of sex, just the sex act, being naked and whatnot. So you're talking maybe about a month out of the most vigorous sexualized person out of say an average of 80 year life. So 1/80th times 12, so you're talking 190. So almost like 1/1000th of one's life is actually spent having sex. Yes, you can say we think about sex and whatnot, but and obviously it's needed for procreation, but it's not that big a thing. Yet, despite it being so overblown in proportion to its real world day to day necessity, versus say eating or shitting or breathing or walking, there's so many things that we do
All
or
things that are
thinking.
far more time consuming.
Right. And yet for all of the way out of proportion focus that's focused in culture about sex, it's so poorly done. It's either just base pornography, or it's this ludicrous over romanticized crap that right wingers like to push. And so very few people actually deal with it on a real level. I did a whole book. I think I sent you all my books. There's a book I have that's called Ugly Girls, and it's basically 12 or 13 stories about women who are considered unattractive in one way or another and how they deal with their loneliness. And sex is certainly at the center of that book in a certain sense. It's the loneliness that comes from sex, but it's also more existential loneliness as well. But it so there's a way of trying to deal with that kind of a topic in a novel way, because simply writing about the sex act is kind of boring. If you read as you read further on in A Norwegian in the Family, there are any number of sex scenes, but the sex scenes are usually preludes to other things. Someone's in bed with someone doing this, that, or the other. Have you gotten to the point? Have you gotten to the part yet with Carla Schmidt Maravelli when she's plotting with her lover to kill someone?
I've only read
Okay.
for 5 or 6 hours, maybe, so probably not.
Yeah. So yeah, you'll get to that, and sex is around that. One of my favorite scenes, speaking of loneliness, I think I mentioned this too, is I have a scene later on in the book where the killer Tony Luft uh, is trying to hit on this woman Carla, who's hiring him to try to kill her husband Paulie, and and she turns him down for the job to kill someone because she doesn't think he's intelligent enough, and he asks her out for coffee, and so she rejects him, and he's in a basement. After she leaves, he's jerking off, and it's a scene that's funny, but it also is one of those scenes that's similar to the scene in Vincetti Brothers where we're dealing with the voice when Gino goes down and finds this guy tied up in at the bottom floor of an abandoned meat processing plant or whatever the fuck it was. But so you have to have these kinds of scenes where the sex is something more. You probably have read at least probably the first scene where Tony Luft is at Christmas in his
Yep.
apartment and lonely. Well, every year chronologically through the book, 8 years total, there are 8 different iterations of that where it plays out in slightly different ways. And as I said, in the Vincetti Brothers, it's about doubling. In the Norwegian, because it's long, it's more than doubling. It's repetition, repetition, repetition of a lot of tropes and ideas and stuff in different ways. And so, sex is one of those things that you have to again constantly be moving, parallax. The easiest way to get a full picture of something is to have many eyes upon it, to have many people commenting on it, whether it's characters. If you're in a play, it's called a star entrance. If you want to know, probably one of the best star entrances in film is Harry Lime's entrance by Orson Welles in The Third Man. Because for the first 45, 50 minutes, maybe it's even close to an hour, maybe it's even over an hour, people are talking about, Harry Lime this, Harry Lime scum, I loved Harry Lime, Harry Lime. And then he finally comes in. 99 times out of 100, the buildup isn't worth it. That's one of the few films where it is worth it.
There's a star entrance already that I've gotten to with Big Frank, and since I have read Vincetti Brothers, I am familiar with Big Frank, and he just walks into Little Linguini's, and it's in a way a chilling moment, just because you know exactly his relationship to Polly and what he does. At least at that point, we kind of know. I know I can already feel that it may take what happened in Vincetti and throw it away, but it's an interesting thing. It's very filmic in that way. There's certain characters that come up and that you're familiar with, especially if you've read all the books in sequence, that have their all-star turns, and it's a build up to that. It doesn't just start with Polly or Frank or anything. It has a slow build because it's a much longer text and it requires something like that.
Well,
the whole idea of layering, by the way, Dan, that you mentioned is cogent to true life as well, because you see the arc of your development there as well, because there are memoirs that, while they stand on their own, you'll have a layering scene that also similarly stands on its own but deepens it in that context, and they complex from that. It's something that is missed all the time, and there's different ways to do it. Your way isn't necessarily just the only way. That Jessica has certainly some layering scenes in hers, but it's 360 degrees of how you deal with it.
Well, you mean 180 degrees?
Well, she takes the 180 degrees and then turns it all the way to 360.
Yeah. But well, she generally in her books, Jessica. I guess the difference is Jessica, in a sense, is more like Bergman in that she focuses microscopically, whereas I'm sort of more like Antonioni, and I pull back and give a bigger palette. And in my world, even though my characters, in a sense, are more relatable in some ways, and they talk more like normal people, there's also more of a distance to it. Whereas Jessica, even though in some ways her writing and her narrative approach is more intellectualized, she's more right there scanning people's faces. Whereas I tend to have, well, my books are a lot bigger in size and also in the scope of the people.
She's inside out, you're outside in.
Yeah.
I also want to talk on the one more aside on the sex scenes. There's the Dear Sister chain letter. This is a somewhat humorous little letter that goes around all the women that wronged you, and they'll have the name attached to it as well as the
what page is that on? Yeah, I know that. What page?
Well, it's on several pages, so I can't direct you to all of it. I can find it though very easily. Just give me one moment. You'll have to edit this part out, Dan.
Oh, go ahead.
Days. Oh, yes, here it is. It's on page 61.
61? Dear Sister, okay, yeah.
Anyway, the Dear Sister chain letter, they're an amusing little trope too. Yeah. But it also gets into the whole idea of the sex scenes too, because this is just one angle that you deal with it in that way, because these are people that you offed in some way or another, or pursuits that didn't go that way. But some of your trysts you don't even remember the faces of, or even the name. Yeah. But that's an interesting little characterization of you. Plus, it also shows that what you take more, what you think is more important to is the relationship itself and how relevant it is to you. Because it's not as if you're forgetting names and faces from people that had direct relationships with you. You're just forgetting their names and faces if they have nothing but just a 15-minute tryst.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm just looking at, yeah. I mean, you look through like a work like this. I mean, again, even just any 4 or 5 in a row, I'm doing things that you'd say, oh, why couldn't I have thought of that? So that when I encounter the rare thing that someone is doing interestingly or whatnot, I'll always try to copy it. I'll change it and twist it for my own particular needs or whatnot. But you know, I don't. It's like just ridiculous. Why don't people? Where is that impulse? If you're really creative, just A, B to C to what. There is no creativity if you're just doing things in that A to B to C manner. And it goes back to this woman, Judith Kitchen, that, and again, she was a nice person. And I say that only because the very act of criticizing her writing and basically that, she was not particularly a talented writer. People say, how can you say that about someone? Well, it's true. Just because I like someone, there are plenty of people I like. I'm not going to tell them that they're an artist or that this, that, and the other thing that they want to hear if I don't see that. But we live in a society where people want to constantly be glad-handed. They want to be told a bunch of pablum. But all it does, because if you praise someone like Judith Kitchen as some great insightful critic or a writer of substance or whatnot, and again, I'm going to have to do an essay over the next few weeks when I have some time between more important things. When you praise that kind of writing or that career or whatnot, you are asking for more of the same because you are setting the bar so low. Stop calling people who are mediocre great. Stop calling people who are bad good. Stop saying people who are terrible as passable writers or they're experimental. We can't say that they're good. So anything that we don't realize, well, it's experimental. No, it's not experimental. This is the kind of thing. Yeah. If I want to dip my foot in ox dung and then stamp out on a large canvas on the floor, ox dung painting by feet. That's not experimental. That's just fucking around. There's no because if you said, well, here's the work, and you don't say, oh, it's ox dung done by foot painting. No one's going to understand that, and they're just going to look at the thing. You have to look at things. Gets back to objectivity. This whole narrative of what things were or how they were made is irrelevant. Jessica is reading Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, and I had told her about Thomas Merton. He's a Catholic priest who had Orientalist tendencies, and he was a good writer, a prose writer. His poetry is mediocre, but he was against the Vietnam War. He died in a freak accident back in the 60s. And so she's reading his book, and she's saying it's one of the better biographies, not quite as good as Lauren Isley, but he probably led a life just as interesting, if not more so than Isley. And I'm going to try to do a story on him. But I got her into Merton, and she's saying how Merton was praising, said he had a teacher when he went to college. His teacher in writing was this guy Mark Van Doren, and I've mentioned Mark Van Doren before. He was actually a pretty good poet. He wasn't a great poet, but he wrote good, solid poetry. Out of his 1,000-page collected poem books, there's maybe 40 or 50 pages that's subpar, but 950 pages or so of good, solid poetry at minimum to very good poetry at best. Maybe 2 or 3 times he may have stumbled onto greatness, but a very admirable poet because he, just like Thomas Hardy, but far more successfully than Thomas Hardy, his poetry, he did play around with form and whatnot. And Merton talks about him and saying that he learned from Van Doren, this is back in the 1940s, that what the new critics of the 1950s said, that it doesn't matter where the provenance of the art has to stand by itself. If it can't stand by itself, it's utterly worthless as art. I mean, it really is. You can have art that stands by itself and that can be enhanced. You can have the cherry on top that putting it into a certain political or philosophic or time-sensitive era can add to it. That's good, but it has to reach a certain level of quality all by itself. And Merton saw this years ago. Van Doren saw this. Anyone who's really a great artist knows this, even if they puke the pablum, like you said, in their private sides, they know this. And most of these people will know that they're bad writers. I can't really conceive that a Donald Hall or a James Tate really thinks that they're good poets. I know that someone like what's his name, Robert Bly. I know because I've talked with him. I confronted him. I know that he knows that he's a phony. I know this. And Don Moss was there when I confronted him, so he could tell you too. Uh, uh, and so, these people, I believe that there are people who are deluded. But this gets back to why David Foster Wallace. Why did he kill himself? Maybe he had problems in other areas, but I really think that he probably knew he was a phony. He had no talent. I really do. I don't see how you can't read the shit of a Dave Eggers or a James Fry, then read Jessica Schneider or Dan Schneider stuff and say it's even the same pursuit. Really, it's not. It's at such a the difference in degree has become a difference in kind. And this is the thing I was talking about the guy with psychopathy yesterday too, about the difference of degree and kind. Greatness, in a sense, is a transmutating thing in that it transmutes something from degree to kind, a difference of kind. A great poem is a different creature than just a good solid poem or a piece of doggerel. Piece of doggerel is much closer to the good poem than the good poem is to the great poem. The great poem has passed over the Rubicon. It is in another country. It's the stranger in the strange land. Greatness has that ineffable quality. It's the circularity that you get by stopping by Woods on Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. It's the feeling that you get from just a few bars played from a Satie piano etude. It's the thing that you see the first time I saw, for example, the paintings of Jiwei Tu, and you saw this face, and you saw, he paints a face as uniquely as Rembrandt did, but it's totally Jiwei too. And the greatness of it, I could go into, if I had something in front of me, I could say, well, look at this. This highlights this. But believe me, there is that bang moment that the guy, the psychopathy guy I spoke to, James Fallon, said scientists are always looking for that aha moment, that eureka moment, and that's what greatness does in art. It gives you that bang, that I've got this, I've understood this connection. And it gets back to what we were saying about people who claim that they're creative. They want to believe that they're capable of that, but I really think they don't. They like to delude themselves. And the reason you get these MFA mafia scams, the reason you get this whole granting thing, this whole corrupt edifice that it kills culture, is because people will say, "Well, I won't tell on you if you don't tell on me." You know, I know that you're a Douglas, and you know that I'm a shit painter, but we won't say anything about each other. I won't badmouth you if you don't badmouth me. Well, it's not badmouthing, because I'm not. When I attack someone like a Jackson Pollock or a David Foster Wallace or a Clement Greenberg, the scam artist who promoted Pollock's shit, or Rothko's garbage, or John Cage and his silent music, I'm not attacking them personally. I'm calling them out the exact same way that I would a hustler on the street who's playing three-card Monte or doing the walnut scam. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, that speaks to my character and the character of anyone else who does call that out, because they should call it out, because it's the correct and it's the ethical thing to do.